In this review of the THULE TOPRIDE bike rack, I'll cover what you get, how to put it together, how to use it, and what I think of it. And also how I tried to actually avoid buying it. Hi, I'm Dave T, and when I purchased a new electric mountain bike a few months back, one of the things that I knew I was going to have to do was purchase a new bike rack. That's because unlike my old bike's 100x9 quick release axle, my new bike used a Boost 110x15 thru-axle, which is not compatible with my current Thule 561 OutRide rack. Now, Thule do make two racks that are compatible with Boost 110 axles, which are the TOPRIDE for about £240 recommended price, and the Fast Ride for about 190. But the Fast Ride actually requires an adapter kit, which then costs an additional 50 quid. So basically I'd have to fork out, pun intended, about £240 either way. Now, in an effort to save money, I did actually adapt my existing OutRide rack, so stick around to hear how well that went. It's not all bad news. But in the meantime, spoiler alert, I purchased the TOPRIDE, so let's get into the review of that first. The TOPRIDE comes, unsurprisingly, in a pretty large box which has stacks of information about the rack's features printed on the outside. When opened, the rack is neatly packed in more cardboard and just a few plastic bags. Fully unpacked, the rack body comes in two parts to reduce packaging length. There's a couple of instruction booklets, an accessory bag for the supplied adapters, and an array of smaller parts that require some assembly with the supplied Allen key. First step of the instructions is a warning about the spring-loaded jaws that hold the axle piece, and the closing speed and force of this is pretty vicious. So make sure that you push it closed from behind the rear jaw with no fingers in the way. I recommend you make sure that it's in a closed position before you start assembly to make sure you don't trigger it by accident. Now, the next step is joining the main rack parts, and this should be easy, and it is, but the manual gives the impression that the rack rail needs to be slid into the clamp section further than is actually possible. I've reached out to the supplier to confirm, but I suspect that so long as the rail fills the view through the inspection hole, it is actually sufficiently inserted. The rails are then locked together by tightening the two hex bolts on the underside of the plate to the recommended 6 Newton meters. Next, the lock bodies need to be inserted by first lining up the locks, and then with the key inserted, sliding it into place until the lock face is flush. It is worth mentioning here that it is possible to get matched sets of Thule locks to avoid having multiple keys if you have several Thule products. I used the lock bodies from my existing rack, which is already key matched to my other racks and roof bars, which is why the key style looks slightly different from what came with the actual rack. The next step is fitting the rear wheel strap, which highlights two improvements over my previous OutRide rack. The strap now has a rubber sleeve to protect the wheel rims, which is a great addition if you have carbon rims. And there is also an extra metal loop on the wheel tray, which allows for the strap to be tucked in out of the way when holding the bike. I know from experience that this is going to be a really helpful feature when loading. It's also worth pointing out at this point that you should decide if your rack is going to be placed on the left or the right hand side of the car, because otherwise you're going to have to move the strap later, like I had to. The rack clamps are next to assemble with T-bolts if you're using the Thule sidebar, wing bar or pro bar roof bars. Other clamp connectors are available as an additional purchase if you have other bar types. Once you have the clamps attached in the main body of the rack, then it's pretty much ready to be attached to the roof bars of your vehicle. This is just a case of sliding the T-bolts into the channel on the roof bars and then tightening both clamps down by turning them with a handle pointing upwards and then pressing the handle down. If it's easy to press the handle down, it's not tight enough. The front clamp can be locked, which avoids your brand new bike rack from being stolen from the car. Now, the TOPRIDE uses an axle replacement approach for loading the bikes, and there are two attachment barrels that come with the rack along with a range of adapters for the thru-axle barrel. This is possibly the one disadvantage of the TOPRIDE over my previous Thule racks, in that there are additional components separate from the rack that you need to keep safe and remember. As I'll explain shortly, this approach is actually well worth that slight inconvenience, but just remember that if you lose these bits, you can't use the racks. But to be fair, they do provide an accessory bag to keep these in, and knowing Thule, I'm sure you can buy replacements. I'll get the quick release axle type out of the way first, as it's the simplest. First, you unwind the lever until you get an adequate gap on both sides to insert the fork ends into. Then drop the axle in between the forks and retighten. The unit has a built-in torque control which will make a click sound once it is tight enough, which is a very nice feature. Back to my main bike now, and the shorter axle barrel needs to have an adapter added to each end. There are 5 pairs of adapters coming with the kit, and each of these is thoughtfully labelled with the axle diameter and length that it is to be used with. Simply snap off 2 of the required adapters and add 1 to each end of the axle. There's a spring clip built into the barrel so they won't fall off once clicked into place. To attach to the bike, remove the wheel, put the adapter between the forks and reinsert the bike's original axle and tighten as normal. With the axle adapter in place, the bike is now ready to load. Now, before loading the bike, make sure that the jaws are in the open position by pressing down on the large lever and pushing the jaw backwards. Also, it's a good idea to tuck the rear strap into that extra loop in the tyre tray so that it's out of the way. One of the reasons I purchased the TopRide, even after I'd already converted my old OutRide rack, is that the loading process is much safer. I have a Land Cruiser, so the roof is pretty high, and the previous racks all needed the forks to be precisely aligned when loading the bike. With the TopRide, the axle adapter simply needs to be lowered between the jaws. That's a pretty large target to miss compared to the millimetre precision required to load the straight fork mounted design. Now, I've taken bikes all over the UK and Europe using roof racks, and whilst I've not tipped the bike over yet, I've come close, so this extra safety is definitely worth the money. Once the axle is seated in the jaws, simply push the rear jaw forward until the spring action pulls it shut with a snap. The green safety catch should be visible. If it's not, then release the jaws and check that the axle is not offset or blocked, and then try again. Next, importantly, before you forget, attach the rear wheel strap. It's worth pointing out that you can fit the rack with the forks to be at either the front or the back of the vehicle. Having the forks at the back is slightly safer in the case of forgetting to attach the rear wheel strap, since in the case of braking with the rear wheel not being attached, the results are, well, less catastrophic. If, like me, you have a tall car and find you need to step into the door to get full access, then you may find the rear facing is harder to load with the doors open, but as I say, fit the strap immediately to reduce the chance of forgetting. The security cable can be unlocked from the rack and pulled out to then wrap through the rear wheel and be locked back onto itself. This type of cable only provides the bare minimum of security, but it's still useful to have if nothing else. I tend to use a much stronger cable to lock the bikes to the rack when we travel, and I still even then avoid leaving the car unattended with the bikes on the roof. Unloading the bikes is pretty much the reverse process. Simply unstrap and unlock the rear wheel. Open the axle jaws by pressing down on the large lever and pulling the jaws back, and then simply lift the bike off the rack. Now, before I get to my conclusions of the TopRide, let's cover the alternative that I mentioned at the start of the video. As I mentioned, my previous bike rack was an OutRide which only supports QR on an older thru-axle size. However, I did find a small engineering company called SiCD Limited, based in Aberdeen, Scotland, that produced these beautifully CNC machined bike rack adapters for the OutRide for just £22.50. Fitting this adapter is a very simple process which takes just a few minutes, involves undoing the 2 U-bolts on the underside of the rack head. This releases the tension on the retaining U-bolts and allows the old QR assembly to slide out, and then the SiCD adapter simply slides in its place. Obviously, you then retighten the bolts. If you already have an OutRide, then this is an obviously much lower cost solution to holding bikes with Boost 110x15 thru-axles, and I believe they make adapters for other sizes as well. I use this for several trips and it certainly does work, but there were some limitations, which is why I finally decided to buy the TopRide. Apart from being borderline too short for my new bike, the most significant limitation for me was the ease of loading. The axle recesses on the forks need to be precisely aligned on the rack adapter. Just a few millimetres either way on one fork leg or both will drop, risking tipping the bike over. On a lower car, this is easier to avoid, but after a few near misses, I decided the risk wasn't worth it. Also, there is no bike lock with the thru-axle adapter on the OutRide. I did actually try and design and 3D print a locking mechanism that used the original lock barrels. It was an interesting experiment, did kind of work, but it wasn't really strong enough, so I gave up in the end. So to summarise, what are my final thoughts on the THULE TopRide? Well, I've had at least 3, if not 4 different THULE roof-mounted bike racks over the past couple of decades, as well as a couple of cheaper unbranded racks. The THULE racks are certainly expensive, but they last for years and have a pretty good resale value, so you certainly get what you pay for. It's been interesting to see the number of improvements that the TopRide has added to the basic front wheel rack design. The jaw mechanism, without a doubt, is easier and safer to load bikes than the older approach, and it also makes the rack more versatile in terms of loading side. More minor improvements like the rubber rim protector are a great idea. Also, personally, I prefer the look of the all black design rather than the old black head and silver aluminium rail. The security cable is probably less secure than the old axle, but that didn't really work on thru-axles anyway, and in security terms, it's a bit like comparing a chocolate versus a cheese fireguard, so I'm not really going to mark it down for that. All in all though, I'd thoroughly recommend the TopRide rack. It fits a wide range of bike types, and as a THULE product, I certainly expect it to last for years. I hope you found this video helpful and useful, and if you have, then please do hit that like button, and if you're interested in seeing other videos that I make, then perhaps subscribe to my channel. But most of all, thanks for watching.